So if you recall a book review of sorts that dealt with a few different books, book recommendations. And one of the things that I asked if you would be interested in a book review. And I got a lot of really, favorable comments about doing a book review. So that's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to do a book review a little bit differently. And I'm going to start with the classic text, Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. And this text was first published in 1933. Carter Godwin Woodson, right? Let's talk a little bit about Carter G. Woodson. We just got out of Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson was the second Black American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard. The first one was W.E.B. Du Bois. Carter G. Woodson is unique in the sense that he was a master educator. He was an educator. He was a teacher. He was a pedagogist. He's the person who invented what we now know as Black History Month. It started out Negro History Week, and then it eventually became what we call today Black History Month. And the rationale was similarly aligned with his thesis in this book. And that was that Black people were largely miseducated. Black Americans in the U.S., the U.S. educational system was more interested in teaching Black children from the perspective of white people. And he suggested that Black children, for their self-confidence, they needed to see themselves in a light that wasn't only subservient to white people. More or less, right? Like those are my own words. I put that in my own words. But that was pretty much that was the gist of what Negro or Black History Month was about. Today I'm going to introduce to you four different books, and all built around the miseducation of the Negro. All right, now stay with me. Now, James Anderson's book, The Education of Blacks in the South Between 1860 and 1935. Now, this book came out in 1988. And this book highlights the reconstruction and the miracle of Black education. Right at the end of enslavement, Black Americans did two things. They built churches and they built schools. First two things they did. Now, remember, the reason why that's significant is because prior to the ending of slavery, education and learning was against the law. If you were caught teaching or learning or teaching an enslaved person how to read or anything like that, you could be punished. And that punishment could cost you your life. But the fact that in 1865, 10% of Black people were literate, even though they understood that learning how to read could cost you your life. But yet, it was found that 10% of Black people were literate. By 1880, that number rose. Just in 15 years, it rose from 10% to what? From 10% to what? Show of hands, take a guess. Who wants to guess? 50%. If you said 50%, you were right. So from 1865 to 1880, the literacy rate amongst Black people went from 10% to 50%. And just in 15 years. Now, by 1930, so from 1865 to 1930, it goes from 10% to what? It goes from 10% to 50% in 1880. By 1930, it goes to 80%. 80% of Black people were literate by 1930. This rise is considered the most rapid literacy expansion in modern history. If you want to understand education, Black education in the United States, if you want to understand it, you have to read this book. You have to know the content of this book. I'm not saying you have to read this book, but for me, this book helped shape and frame what I thought I knew about Black education and the evolution of Black education. It helps make sense of the fact that there's 115 historically black colleges and universities that are still operable today. And all of them are over 120 years old. It helps put that into context. All right. So education was not given to black Americans. It was built by black Americans. Education was built. The ways in which we view the modern educational system today, the ways in which the modern education exists today is because of the push for education by black Americans. How so? Because when the northern philanthropists started to come into the South and visit the schools in the South, initially they thought that they would come, and that they would find that they were just in disarray and that they could come and they could help and they could do, but they were in shock by how well ran these schools were. And not only that, but the effort and the energy in which black communities put into education caused for the government to say, okay, so the mandate for public education as we know it today, this is just a review, and this is a review of James Anderson's book. The mandate for education as we know it today is the result of the efforts by the black Americans in the segregated South. Because of their push for education, right? The federal government said, we have to mandate education for everybody because we can't have a literate black population and a largely illiterate population of whites. It will cause mass hysteria because you got to understand in this time, right? Education wasn't really a priority. People were concerned about working and work, right? And nobody cared about education for the most part, except for the aristocrats, right? So the aristocrat class were those who, valued education the most. But the commoners, I'm talking about Europeans and white people at that time, they didn't really value education in that way. But because of the push and the strive for education in the segregated black schools and the phenomena that it became, the federal government mandated schools. The mandate that exists today for every K through 12 child has to go to school, that mandate started because of the push of black Americans in the South at the end of enslavement. Think about what I just said. This is what we get from Derek Anderson. From James Anderson. All right, there's so much more I can cover in that book, but for the sake of time, I want to tie all of these books together because remember, all of this is on the premise of this book. And now remember, James Anderson's book covers the period between 1860 and 1935. So now, Carter G. Woodson, 1933, what happens? His critique of Eurocentric curriculum. This book is a critique of Eurocentric teaching, curriculum, pedagogy, epistemology, all of that, right? Like fundamentally critical of and sounding the alarm for black educators. Because remember, this is still during the segregated school era. We need to change how we teach black students. So he's talking to who? This book is talking to who? Remember, he's an educator. He's a master educator. He is the father of Black History Month. So who is he talking to? He's talking to other black educators. He's talking to that other group of black educators who are all educating in the segregated schools in the South, in and across the South. He is challenging them to do education differently, right? This is important. He argues that black students were trained for subordination and that he called for education to be centered around black history and self-knowledge, right? And Carter G. Woodson wasn't fighting for access to schools. He was fighting for control over what was taught inside the schools. All right. So now, from 1930, from the time this book happened, from the time this book is published, from 1930, you have this incredible impact of this work. And I'm not just going to contribute it to just this work, but we can't we can't downplay the significance of this work and the significance of the man. We can't overstate the importance of who Carter G. Woodson was to education in the United States, specifically the education of Black folks, Black Americans. We can't undervalue it. We can't whisper about it. It was significant what he did, because now what happens is, because the educators understood what Carter G. Woodson was saying, and because he was a pedagogist, he provided and he offered a strategy of what to do and how to do it. And the black educators picked up on it, and they took it and they ran with it. So now what happens? So from 1933, when this book was published, the year that this book was published, for the next 3 decades, you have the children who are coming through the K through 12 segregated schools, going off into college. They would eventually become what? They would eventually become the children and the young adults who would become those who created the infrastructure for the civil rights movement. Carter G. Woodson, in my view, in my read of Carter G. Woodson, he had perhaps arguably the biggest impact on the civil rights movement, and the biggest impact and the less discussed. I mean, that's just how I read it. I mean, maybe this ain't breaking news. Maybe somebody else said this somewhere before too. I'm just saying, like, how I read, how I see Carter G. Woodson, he had the biggest impact that's not discussed. It's not discussed, the impact that he had, because what happens post or after the miseducation of the Negro, what happens is Black students start to learn about themselves. And then there's a nurturing that comes, a Black pride that comes. It's very intentional. It was there before in the period 1860 to 1935. It was there, but it wasn't as intentional. Carter G. Woodson made it intentional. He made it intentional. He was intentional about removing the Eurocentric curriculum out of education. He made it intentional about replacing that with Black history and Black knowledge. He made that intentional. And that's the first time that we see that happen. And we see it at the scale of someone like Carter G. Woodson. And the impact that it had is clear by the time we get to the 1960s and the civil rights movement. We see it in the music, we see it in the arts, we see it in the culture, we see it in the intellectuals. We get the Black and I'm proud, we get the people wearing the afros, we get the Black folks wearing the dashikis, we get the Black folks with real Black power, Black nation. Carter G. Woodson, his impact on that, right? So now you have the United States reaches a boiling point by the 1960s, right? So now we go to what? We talk about Leslie Fenwick, Jim Crow's Pink Slip. Now this book comes out in 2022, and this book was a watershed moment for me. This book had the same impact on me as the first 2 books that I just mentioned. These are books that I absolutely love. I teach from them often. Anyone who's ever taken any of my classes, they know I teach this book. I teach these books all the time. And when Jim Crow's Pink Slip came out, it found itself in heavy rotation. Students love this book, right? And some of the key contributions or the key highlights for this book, you had the evidence of which came about in the 1971 court hearing in San Francisco, wherein the courts heard complaints of the over 100,000 Black educators who lost their job as a result of the Brown versus Board decision. You have Black principals who were demoted and Black teachers who were fired. So integration meant closing Black schools. It meant demoting and firing Black educators. That's what we get from this, really from the impact of Carter G. Woodson. Really, I mean, that's how I read it. That's how I read it. Well, that's how I'm going to explain it. Carter G. Woodson's impact led to a boiling point, the civil rights movement, which led to we need to take control of these schools because we can't have generation after generation of black students being taught in this manner with in this method. We need to seize control of it. Now, maybe that wasn't the intention. Maybe it wasn't explicitly stated in that way, but it doesn't matter because the result of what happened since is exactly and precisely that. The control of our schools and the decline in black education ever since. So people often miscalculate or misunderstand the segregated black schools, right? They weren't all bad. They were all underfunded and under-resourced, but they weren't all bad. That's a misnomer. That's a myth. Many of the black schools were outperforming their white counterparts in the same districts and in the same cities and throughout the state. There are so many examples of this, so many examples of black schools, segregated schools, outperforming everything around it. And elite black educators. Because one thing that happened, black folks were genius in this way. We gotta know black history like for real. We gotta teach black history like for real. Black folks were genius, and especially the black folks in the South. Because this is where it all started. This is what we get from Jim Crow's pink slip. If you were an educator in the South, right, teacher, and say you wanted to go and get your master's, or say you had your master's and you wanted to get your doctorate, by law, in the Jim Crow South, you had to go where? You had to go to an HBCU. Now, if that HBCU in your state didn't have your major, then you could go anywhere else in the country. They'll pay for you. You just couldn't go anywhere in the South. This was what Jim Crow mandated. So the black educators who were seeking master's degrees and doctorate degrees would end up going to schools like the University of Michigan, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Iowa State, these different, elite institutions that weren't operating by Jim Crow law. And so they were getting this training and this cutting edge education, and then coming back to the South and showing out. And so this is a big part of why the schools in the South were outperforming. This is one of the reasons. It's not telling the whole story, but this is a very important part of the story that people don't talk about. People don't know even. But this is what comes out in Jim Crow's pink slips. And so what happens is you have black educators who are the most credentialed and have the most education during the period of segregated schools, of Jim Crow schools in the South. Another thing that is important to note about this book is that when the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down from the Supreme Court and desegregated schools, right? The federal government was very intentional about a couple of things, two things in particular. They said they were not going to allow for black educators or black principals to lead black teachers. And they were not going to allow black teachers to teach white students. It's not happening. And this was the fatal blow that led to what Leslie Fenwick calls Jim Crow's pink slips. So these black educators were sort of like moved out of position, and who slid into their position were white people who weren't, in many cases, who were not even educators. And then this led to the creation of the assistant principal, the teacher assistants. These jobs and these roles were filled by the black educators who had all the experience and all the expertise. And so what happened was it would eventually allow for the white educators to gain the expertise right? It would allow for them to gain the expertise and the experience to become educators, to become principals under the tutelage of their more credentialed, more educated, more experienced Black assistants. This is where the assistant roles, assistant superintendent, assistant principal, teaching assistants, this is where these roles are rooted. This is where they come from. And this entire system of education that it became is what is the foundation of the modern educational system in the United States of America today. Jim Crow's Pink Slip, Leslie Fenwick. All right. So now let's go to the last book. Now, the reason I chose Derek Bell's book, Silent Covenants, the book was published in 2005. Derek Bell is Derek Bell is an icon. He's an absolute, a flat out icon. Now, the thing about Derek Bell is this. I mentioned that he is probably the foremost legal mind in the last century. Everybody knows Thurgood Marshall, but we should know Derek Bell. We don't know Charles Houston either, but that's another conversation. But we should know Derek Bell. We should also know Charles Houston. But I digress. Derek Bell. All right. Now, Derek Bell was, as I mentioned, he was one of the lawyers when the Supreme Court mandated Brown versus Board, right? And, the school districts across the South had to implement the law. Now, if they were found to not be implementing the law, the Supreme Court would send a cadre of lawyers into the South to, argue on behalf of the Supreme Court and make them, acquiesce or adopt the law. Derek Bell was one of those lawyers who went into the Deep South, often under, hostile circumstances, death threats. He would have to get picked up by Black people who would often be armed and who would give him places to stay, and they would watch the door that wherever he stayed while he was there, to litigate or to argue the case on behalf of the Supreme Court. He would be under armed watch sometimes. So he was literally putting his life on the line. And he thought, in his own words, in Silent Covenants, he thought that what he was doing, he thought that he was part of some noble crusade for fighting to integrate schools. And he said that he would often meet people when he went into the Deep South. He would often meet people and community members, educators, who would say to him, who would debate with him or who would argue with him and tell him, say, what you're doing is wrong. We don't want our kids in these integrated schools. We want to educate our kids. We didn't fight for this. We don't agree with this. And Derek Bell he said he would often, sort of like kind of be flippant towards them. I mean, that wasn't the word he used, but just for lack of a better word, he would be, sort of flippant towards this position, thinking, oh, these people just don't know any better, right? He felt like he knew better. But then he said, over time, I started to realize that over the course of his career, he started to realize that he was actually on the wrong side of this after decades of fighting on behalf of the Supreme Court. So now by the 1980s, as he's starting to become, this legal scholar, and he becomes, seated at Harvard, and he has this change of mind and this change of heart, and he realizes something. He has an epiphany. And so the latter years of his life, he started to rewrite and rethink what he thought about the Brown versus Board decision. As a legal mind, as a legal scholar looking at the law, Derek Bell is often credited as being the father of critical race theory. If you're not in education, I can imagine that it's easy for people to misunderstand the impact that K through 12 education had on the development of the civil rights leaders in that group, or that 2 or 3 generations of Black people. in their strength, in their fight, in their resilience for Black power, in their push for their desire for Black love and Black community, and their love of Black people and their love of their Blackness, right? And it was manifest in the songs that they sang. It was manifest in how the way they wore their hair, and how there was nothing Eurocentric about them. They were Black. They were proud and they were Black. They weren't trying to look like anybody else. They weren't trying to fit into any European standard. They were the standard. And a lot of that had to do with the nurturing that happened in the K through 12 schools. So I'm going to close with this. The story of Black education is not this deficit model that we've been sold. It is about determination. It is about a people who built schools against the law, against the odds, who cultivated literacy against the law, against the odds, and who fought to control the education of their children until the law said that they couldn't. The question that these 4 books leave us with is not whether Black Americans valued education, because the history makes that clear. The question is whether the nation has ever been willing to allow Black education to exist on its own terms. Black Americans never lacked the will to learn. The struggle has always been over who controls what they are allowed to know. So the history that we talked about is not about a history of failure. It's about interruption. It's not about failure. It's about an interruption. A people who built education against the law, right? And use knowledge to create pathways to freedom. And again, when Black education moved toward autonomy, structures emerged to regulate, redirect, and or dismantle it. So the question is not whether Black communities value education. We already know that. We already know the answer to that. So the last thing I want to do is this. We, like I mentioned in the outset, we talked about the book club. And so what we'll do is we're going to launch a free book club. And this will be a space where we read and break down, books that I think are powerful by Black authors. I mean, there were 4 of them that I gave here. I think, 4. So James Anderson, The Education of Blacks Between 1860 and 1935, published in 1988, classic. Carter G. Woodson, of course, classic. The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, almost 100 years ago. The third one was Leslie Fenwick, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, 2022, classic, modern classic. This book is 50 years ahead of its time. And the fourth one was Derek Bell's Silent Covenants, 2005, former dean of Harvard Law School. So if you're looking for deeper dialogue, stronger analysis, and a community committed to growth through reading, I suggest that you join this book club. For now, it's free. So just click the link below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Tell your friends, share with your friends. Tell them to subscribe as well. And that's it for now, y'all. Peace. Word up, quick to set it, don't wet it. Real niggas lick shots, peace, Connecticut. Yo, what up, yo? Time is running out, it's the real though. Let's connect politics,